What is commonly called a basic income is a specific form of a minimum income scheme. It's specific because it's unconditional in three senses in which what we know, what exists by way of a minimum income scheme is not. So, first of all, basic income is strictly individual, which means that the right to the basic income is independent of the family situation. No need to see whether you live with anyone else or on your own in order to decide whether you are entitled to it and how high that income is going to be. Two, it is what's commonly called universal, which means that it is paid upfront, ex ante, no questions asked, to everyone, rich or poor. No need to know whether you have an income from work, whether you have some wealth, in order to decide whether you are entitled to it and how high this income is going to be. And thirdly, it is also what you could call obligation-free, in the sense that there is no work test, no need to check whether you are able to work, willing to work, available for any job that may suit your skills, in order to decide whether you are entitled to it or how high the income is going to be. So, the basic income is really a non-conditional income in the sense of strictly individual, universal, and obligation-free. The question of whether a basic income can be funded, is economically sustainable, is of course a question which you can only ask once you specify the level of that basic income and the country you are thinking of, or the scale at which you are thinking of introducing a basic income. So if you say, well, what about a basic income of 100 euros in Spain or in Germany? Of course, you can fund that. What about a basic income of 1,000 euros in, it depends in which country. And so any question about the economic sustainability of a basic income can only have any sense if you specify the amount, you specify what it is going to replace, and you specify the form the funding should take. And so there is no general answer to the question of whether a basic income can be funded. And there is a clear connection between the argument in favor of a basic income and then the sort of technical change which we witness today. But that relationship is not that simple. We cannot say, well, there is robotization, there is automation, so therefore the jobs will disappear, and because people won't have a job, we need to give them an income. That is not a correct argument, and that's certainly not the argument that must be used in order to defend a basic income. But there is a connection. What is this connection? Well, the combination of labor-saving technical change, so robotization, for example, and globalization, the combination of these two things leads to a polarization of earning power. What does that mean? That means that the people who have the right sort of skill, the right sort of talent that is very lucrative and is made more lucrative because of the technical change and because of globalization, these people see their earning power, their potential income explode. It becomes very, very high because they can sell these skills, they can sell the services on a very large market because of globalization and because their skills fit what is needed for these new technologies, because of the training they had, because of the talents they possess. But at the same time, certainly in rich countries, the people who have the sort of skills that are very widely spread in the world, or the sort of skills that are made obsolete, that are no longer useful given the technological change, these people see their earning power reduced to very little, and indeed to a level that is below the poverty threshold, or the level of income that corresponds to a minimally decent life. And so that is this polarization of earning power, this is the situation we face. And then what can you do in that sort of situation? Indeed, at the bottom you have a growing precariat, or in countries where you have a decent minimum income, you have more and more people being unemployed because their earning power is below what is provided by the local social security system. And in this context, what a basic income does is not at all provide an income to people who are excluded forever from the labor market. No, a basic income is not a safety net for the people who are out excluded forever. No, it is a floor which you put under the whole distribution of income in order to enable people to have access to a meaningful activity. Can be, for many of them, for most of them, it will be some form of paid work, but it can be part-time work. It can be work that provides a lot of training, or that is combined with training on the side. And so this unconditional floor is meant to address this problem of the very sharp polarization of income, which is happening and will continue as a result of the double pressure, the twofold pressure of technical change, particular further automation on the one hand, and globalization on the other hand. I think there is a paradoxical relationship between a basic income and work. So you could say, in a way, that is a challenge to the obligation to work, because in this case you give a right to an income independently, not only of work, but also of the willingness to work. It's not restricted to the people who are unable to work, or willing to work but unable to work. It's not restricted to them. So in this sense, it's a challenge to the duty to work. But it is certainly not an alternative to the right to work. In fact, what way of presenting a basic income, and it's the way in which a professor of social medicine, a Dutch professor of medicine, at the very beginning of the European discussion, 1970s, that's the way in which he came to it. He said, among my patients, I have two categories of people. I have some people who come to me because they are sick, but they are sick because they can't find a job. And then there are other people who come to me and they are sick because they work too much. And so what a basic income does is provide the possibility, or greater possibility, for the people who work too much to work less, or to interrupt their working time, and for people who don't have a job to get access to the jobs that are freed by the people who work too much and are given the possibility of working less. But at the same time, and what is very important, is that basic income is not only obligation-free, that's what enables people to give up part of their job voluntarily and still have an income, but it's also universal in the sense that you can always combine that basic income with income from another source, in particular part-time work. And for many people who are currently excluded, only part-time work is possible because of family constraints sometimes, single parents who have children to look after, or people who have some psychological difficulties in getting back to work. And because it's universal, it's given, whatever your other income, it's really a floor that enables you to get back to work. And so it's absolutely essential not to try to sell basic income as an alternative to the right to work. Work, including paid work, meaning paid employment, is of course essential for many people, and it's important that everyone should have access to that. But at the same time, basic income enables people, then people who with least options, it gives them a wide range of possibilities in paid work and outside of paid work in order to be useful to society. So there is this sort of paradoxical relationship to society, which means, well, at the same time, it lifts this strong connection and suppresses this strong connection between work and income, It is partial uncoupling of work and income. But it doesn't deny that it's very important that everyone should have a real possibility of access to paid employment. Indeed, it is a means of achieving that under 21st century conditions. The anecdote about this goes back to 1987 in Paris. And there was a conference organized in Paris on the occasion of the publication of the French version of the famous book of political philosophy, the founding book of contemporary political philosophy, which is John Rawls's Theory of Justice. John Rawls was a Harvard professor who published this book, which really created a new field in political philosophy, or made political philosophy what it was today. And I had read that book carefully. I had never met John Rawls until that. And I thought that I had found a ready-made beautiful justification for an unconditional basic income. Because this was 87, the idea of basic income had come to me in 1982, and I had been struck in the following years by the fact that the main objection against basic income was not an economic one. The main objection was a moral one. People who said, giving an income for nothing, that is to people who choose to do nothing, that is unacceptable. But I thought that in Rawls's theory of justice, I won't go into the detail, there was a real justification for it. And then it so happened that I had been invited as one of the few people in Europe who had studied this theory at the time and published about it. I had been invited to take part in that conference, and I was staying in the same hotel as Rawls, and Rawls and I were the only two people who got up early in the morning, so we had twice a very long breakfast together where I could ask him 40 questions about his book. And one of these questions, the one I asked with the greatest trepidation, was, isn't it clear that from your second principle of justice, it follows that an unconditional basic income, given to everyone, no questions asked, that this is justified? And he said, no, Philippe, you know, the people who spend all day surfing off Malibu, surely they can't expect society to pay for their living. So that was one of the greatest intellectual disappointments of my life. I thought I had the most prestigious theory of justice there, most influential theory of justice, providing an immediate justification to an idea I thought was really very good. And that was a real problem for me. And so a few years later, 3 years later, he and Amartya Sen had invited me then to give a lecture at Harvard, where I took up the challenge, and I started the lecture by mentioning this anecdote and the analogy also between what Rawls had told me then, and then something that had been said by a Republican senator of Hawaii in the 1960s, when there were all these hippies coming to Hawaii on the beaches, and his slogan was there should be no parasites in paradise. And in a way Rawls was saying the same, that is, people who choose not to work and get an income, these are parasites on the rest of society. Rawls didn't use that term, but that was the challenge. And so part of my work, indeed, I felt, well, if you want to, if you have an idea that's really in some sense revolutionary, you need two things. One is to have an ideology, and the other one is to have a movement. And so in a way, the movement was then what we created, what we had just created then, 1986, which was a very modest network, European network called BIEN, Basic Income European Network, that was founded in Louvain-la-Neuve in September 1986. But I realized that there was also a need for an ideology, that is, for something like a philosophical justification for basic income. And that became my job for much of the following years. And so I published in 1995 this book called Real Freedom for All, which was in a way then an expansion of the lecture I went to give at Harvard under the title Why Surfers Should Be Fed in 1991. And so, but even today, I mean, from both the left and the right, you get this moral objection, and sometimes in a very passionate and emotional way, and it divides the left and it divides the right. And so on the right, some people say, well, you know, we are in favor of freedom, so basic income is a good idea. And some other people say, no, freedom is fine for the rich, but the poor will need to work in order to get their income. And on the left, you have people who fight against capitalism. But why? Some people fight against capitalism because some people are obliged to sell their labor power to the capitalists. And for them, basic income is a fantastic idea because it gives people, it still gives people the option to do paid work, but it frees them of this obligation to sell and to work for capitalists because they need it for survival. So for them, it's fantastic. But some other people fight against capitalism. They find capitalism scandalous because it enables some people to get an income without work, namely the capitalists. And of course, for them, basic income is a catastrophe because it will give to everyone a possibility which fortunately is not now restricted to capitalists, namely the possibility of earning a living without working. So that's why the left is divided. And so I felt at the time, and I still feel now, that we really need to have a strong moral argument in defense of basic income. And I think that argument is available. I can explain more about it if you want, but it may be useful to put things in a broader historical perspective by distinguishing three models of social protection. The oldest model of social protection was born at the beginning of the 16th century in a few Flemish and German towns, and that was social assistance. It was, in a way, you could say, a form of guaranteed minimum income, but very conditional. It was given to the poor. Of course, it was not strictly individual. It took the household situation into account, and it was also very conditional in the sense that people only got this income if they were available for work. Indeed, there were often workhouses in which they had to work, they were forced to work in order to get them. That was the model of social assistance, and the forms of minimum income schemes we have today in developed countries, like the food stamps in the United States, the RSA, Revenu Social d'Intégration, Revenu de Solidarité Active, in France, the other forms of social assistance also in the various autonomous communities in Spain, all these are forms of social assistance. Bolsa Familia in Brazil is a form of social assistance. That was a first model, so very conditional, a form of public charity to the poor. Then you had the second model that was born at the end of the 19th century. It was sort of concocted, imagined by the French philosopher Condorcet at the end of the 18th century, but it was put into place for the first time by Bismarck at the end of the 19th century in Germany. It's a very different model. It's a form of solidarity among workers. Workers want to protect themselves against some risks, illness, invalidity, old age, involuntary unemployment, and they put together some money, social contributions, in order to cover them when these risks materialize. This is a very different model. No longer charity to the poor, it's solidarity among the workers. And basic income corresponds to a third model, not social assistance, not social insurance, but what you could call a social dividend. In case of a basic income, best way to see it is that in fact past technological development, past capital accumulation, and also all sorts of innovations, reforms that have made our societies as efficient as they are, have created a rent. We inherit from the past, from past generations, a wealth that is distributed in the current generation in a very unequal way, mostly through our wages. My own wage as a professor is only to a very limited extent due to my own work, to my own efforts. If I compare my real income as a professor to someone doing the same sort of job 100 years ago, or in Kinshasa or in Calcutta, then I'll see that most of my income is due to the very favorable conditions in which I can exercise this job, and not to the fact that I work harder or longer than these people a long time ago or in other countries. So there is a big rent that is appropriated very unequally between the members of our present society, within each society and across societies. And what a basic income does, it's not go and steal part of the fruit of the work of some people in order to give it to everyone, including people who choose not to work. No, it's distribute in a somewhat more fair way what we've received from the past. So it's a dividend, a social dividend on this commonwealth. So these are the three models. Then this third model, because that's then the other part of your question, so how did it come about? So where? Well, in a way, the core idea of it was formulated for the first time, though not in defense of what would be a basic income, by Thomas Paine, English revolutionary, but very active in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution, who published a little pamphlet that was practically forgotten until the basic income movement rediscovered it in the late 1980s. But he published at the end of the 18th century a little pamphlet that said, well, we are all equally the owners of the earth, of land. And so the value of land should be shared equally between all. And in his proposal, it would take the form of a small endowment, a small wealth that would be given to every young person aged 21 to start life, man or woman, and whatever their circumstances. And then it would also take the form of a small pension, annual pension from age 50. That was his proposal. It was the idea of the social dividend, but related to land, but clearly a model that was different from social insurance and from social assistance. He said repeatedly in that little pamphlet, this is a matter of justice and not of charity. Very different. And so the first formulation of a real basic income for a whole society, for a whole country, was made in a book published in 1848 in Brussels by someone called Joseph Charlier, very enigmatic person who published 4 books in total defending the same idea. The first book was called Solution du problème social, Solution of the Social Problem, and he defended the territorial dividend. It was basically the same idea as Spain, but paid on a quarterly basis every 3 months to every citizen of the country. 1848, the same year as Karl Marx, also in Brussels, wrote the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto was read massively, immediately taken up by a movement. It's still the official guiding document of the most populated country in the world today, China. But despite all that, one may wonder whether the ideas of this poor, forgotten Joseph Charlier may have more future today than Karl Marx's idea at the time. So there was then, Joseph Charlier, I don't know, we never saw any reference to it. It was probably forgotten as soon as he published anything, completely forgotten. There was from time to time a little allusion in this direction, a bit of a debate after the First World War in England, then also a debate, more ample debate, more significant debate in late 60s, early 70s in the United States, where important economists like Jim Tobin and John Kenneth Galbraith managed to convince a presidential candidate, George McGovern, to put it in his program, at least for the primaries. Afterwards he dropped it, and he lost the election to Nixon dramatically. And then it's only in the 1980s, starting in Europe, in Holland, in Denmark, that the idea came up again, very independently of the American debate and the earlier British debate, which had been practically forgotten. And it's in that context that then the Basic Income European Network was founded in 1986. So I organized a conference with a prize I had won for a scenario about basic income. Organized a conference where I gathered the few people in Europe who seemed to defend something like that. And so they gathered, they were surprised to discover each other. Many were surprised they were not the only one to defend that. We created that network that lived very modest, it was before internet, so it was not easy to get a small network to work with post stamps and envelopes to be sent to a few people throughout Europe. But more and more people from outside Europe joined our congresses and asked to receive the newsletters. We had a congress every 2 years, and then in 2004, at the only congress that was held in Spain, in Barcelona, it was decided that Basic Income European Network would become a worldwide network. And because we like the acronym, BIEN, or BIEN in Spanish, we decided to keep the acronym, and that became then the Basic Income Earth Network. Since then we've had congresses in many parts of the world. So the last congress was in Seoul, there has been one in Montreal, there has been one in Cape Town. Among the proposals for the next congress, so this year it's in Lisbon, next year it will be in Finland, but for the following ones, the Indian network would like to have to organize the Congress. The US network would like to organize a Congress. So there are now national sections in many parts of the world, and certainly from, the last year there has been more written and said and discussed about basic income just in 1 year than in the whole of history of mankind before. So it's very important to distinguish proposals that are made at the level of a particular country and proposals that are made at the level of the European Union. For countries like Spain or Belgium or France or Germany, the most sensible proposal in the immediate future is most realistic basic income proposal in the immediate future is one that would be funded by the personal income tax. That is, it would go hand in hand with the reform of the personal income tax that would consist essentially, or mainly I would say, in the abolition of the exemptions of the lower layers of the lower tranche of everyone's income. And so in all our tax systems, personal tax systems, the lower layers of the income, and the first hundreds or sometimes thousands of euros of each person or each household are tax-free. Okay, even the richest person received these gifts from the finance ministry. They said the first hundreds of thousands of euros you earn, they are not taxed. And then afterwards there is a low rate of taxation, 20% or 30%. All this will be scrapped, and there would be a higher level of taxation from the first euro. Of course, the people who have low incomes would have a higher net income, because the basic income they would receive would correspond to more than the additional tax they would need to pay on the lower parts of their income. But people who earn a higher income would then pay more in tax than what they receive as a basic income. So if we consider introducing a basic income at a national level, part of the funding will need to come from this reform of the personal income tax system. But the situation is completely different if we are thinking about a modest basic income at the European level, because there we need to be able to rely on a form of funding, a form of taxation that can be made effective, that can be made operational at the European level. And the most Europeanized of all forms of taxation is the value-added tax. So there is already a harmonized definition of the tax base, because part of the European budget is funded by a fraction of the value-added tax. So that's already present, and it is realistic, therefore, to have a uniform value-added taxation in all the countries involved in the social dividend scheme. Whereas trying to harmonize the income tax, the personal income tax, is a very, very, very difficult task, because the very definition of the tax base for the personal income tax is very different from one country to another. How do you take the family situation into account for the base of the income tax? What do you include? What do you allow people to deduct from the tax base of the personal income tax? And so the expenses related to their job, how is this controlled? If you own your own house, is that taken into account also in the income tax? There are all sorts of details that are not only very different from one country to another, but also politically extremely sensitive. And of course, in order to fund something like a basic income or euro dividend at the transnational level, at the level of the European Union, the tax base will need to be defined in the same way. Otherwise, it will be very unfair. If some countries allow people to deduct many things from the tax base, as they do now, and other countries have a very comprehensive, very expansive definition of the tax base, then it creates unfairness. So you need to harmonize that, and that is a very difficult job politically. So for pragmatic reasons, I believe that the best chance for a euro dividend is the value-added tax. But I wouldn't exclude that part of it could be funded by an EU-wide taxation of corporate profits. That's more realistic to have some sort of harmonization. It's happening to some extent at the moment, a sort of common definition of the corporate tax base, and that's an important step forward also for other reasons, not excluding a financial transaction tax at that level, or a carbon tax, but all these taxes, even the corporate profit tax, have a tax base that is far smaller than VAT, and so you would need, it would be very difficult to get without sort of prohibitive tax rates to get enough in order to fund even a modest level of basic income. 200 euros per person in Europe is a VAT of 19%, and with a very big tax base compared to the tax base of corporate profits, or even more the carbon tax or the financial transaction tax would yield far less in terms. We computed for the carbon tax could yield, I think, up to 14 euros per month under realistic assumptions, and a new white carbon tax. And in the case of the Tobin tax, financial transaction tax, again under some optimistic assumptions, it might be 10 euros per person and per month. So if you want far more, you need to have social security contributions, which would be very difficult to have at the European level. Personal income tax, which for the reasons indicated would be very difficult at European, or VAT. So that's why I'm proposing VAT, and it also leads to all sort of problems, but that's the sort of vision we need to have. Well, there are people, of course there are people both on the right and on the left who defend the basic income for reasons that are quite different sometimes, but also partly similar. And that the fact that there are people on the right and on the left is a disadvantage to get it, the idea on the agenda, but it will be in due time an advantage to make it sustainable. What I mean by that is the following. So now when you discover that there are people who you hate and who you fight against, who defend the idea of basic income, for many people that's sufficient to say, oh, this is an idea I'm not going to defend. This holds for people on the right who discover that, I don't know, that Yanis Varoufakis defends the idea. Oh, they say he defends it. I hate what he says, so I'm going to be against it. But it also holds for people on the left who discovered that Milton Friedman seemed to defend something that looked like that, and that was enough to forget about it. And so you have some blockages that are due to the fact that there are people on both sides who defend it. At the same time, we must realize that if the idea of social assistance and then of social insurance were politically sustainable, it was because they got support on the right and on the left. It's not that it's something that was introduced by the left and then immediately abolished by the right as soon as the right was in power. And so there must be a realization that, in fact, for society to work well, we'll need something like a basic income in the 21st century, just as we needed something like social insurance in the 20th century. Social insurance, let's face it, helped capitalism work better. It saved capitalism from itself. And basic income, in a way, will do that too, because it will enable our society to work not only in a more just way, in a more emancipatory way, but also in a more efficient way, because it will make it far easier to go back and forth between employment, training throughout life, education throughout life, and then unpaid work, voluntary work within the household, and beyond it in the community. And so what we need in the 21st century is something like that, something far more fluid. So therefore it's not surprising that some lucid people, some clear-sighted people on the right should be defending it, including now in the last weeks, Mark Zuckerberg or Richard Branson. I don't know, it may be a bit too easy to characterize them on the right. They are probably among big entrepreneurs rather on the left of the big entrepreneurs, but there are certainly very extremely rich people who also defend that sort of idea. And but so you may then have a realization that this is what our sort of society needs today to make it also more efficient, to make both our economy and our society more efficient. And so I think, and it makes it politically more difficult. And at some moments, for example, in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the 1990s, two ministers in the government proposed making a big step in the direction of a basic income, but immediately some other ministers in the same government strongly opposed it, emotionally opposed it. And so the Prime Minister had to say, Social Democratic Prime Minister, to say, come on, relax guys, the idea is not ripe, and then it was shelved away for another 20 years or so, and it's only now that it's coming back in the debate in Holland. So we'll have to live with this, and the main thing I think to get through is on the right. And I was not long ago, I was invited by the ALDE group of the European Parliament, the party, the Liberal Party, so the party of Verhofstadt and others, at their annual meeting, which was in Slovenia, and they asked me to speak about basic income. My message to them was, look, you liberals, you are in favor of freedom, right? Yes, they all said yes, in favor of freedom. Then I said, you liberals, are you in favor of freedom just for the rich? And then I said, no, for everyone. Then I said, I have a wonderful idea for you. And in fact, some liberals are like that, not all. I mean, some are in favor of freedom only to the extent that it serves the rich. But some really are in favor of the more market and less state, because they think the state is oppressive. And of course, the basic income is something that makes people gives people more freedom, more power, more bargaining power, not only towards the capitalists, but also towards their partner in oppressive domestic relations, and towards the bureaucracy. And it gives people the choice rather than the bureaucrats and so on. And so some liberals like it for that reason. It's not intrusive, people don't come and check with whom you live, whether you are willing to work, etc. And so true liberals must love the idea. And on the left, there is of course a vision of the left that said the left is for equality against freedom. But that should not be what the left is about. It's not a matter of being for equality at the expense of freedom. It's a matter of being for freedom for everyone. But real freedom, which is not just a formal right to go. You have the right to go on holiday in the Baleares or wherever. If you don't have the money to go, you can't go. And so it's and the same for all the other more important aspects of in life than going to the Baleares. But and so the left must not be in favor of equality against freedom, but in favor of the equalization of real freedom. And once you define the left in this way, so in a way it's a libertarian or freedom-friendly left, let's say, well, then basic income must not only is tolerable, but must be a central aspect of what they defend. Of course, not on its own, and it shouldn't be at the expense of public services, it should not be at the expense of a quality environment, it should not be at the expense of a good healthcare system, shouldn't be at the expense of education, but it's an important element that at the same time gives more freedom to say no to certain relations or to certain shitty jobs that don't teach you anything, where you are badly treated, but also the possibility of saying yes to jobs with a good level of training, even if they are badly paid, or the sort of things, uncertain jobs, but as an artist, as an inventor, you want to take the risk, it corresponds to your calling. Well, the basic income will help you do that. And so a freedom-friendly and emancipatory sort of left should embrace the idea, but they may come together with the real liberals, the people who on the so-called right, on the pro-market anti-state right, I mean, fight the state not because it's bad for the rich, but because it's for freedom, and sometimes state is bad for freedom. Well, when the idea came to me in 1982, I found it such a good idea for two reasons. One is that this was already 10 years after the report of the Club of Rome, and the right and the left at the time still saw only one solution for the massive unemployment we had in the early 80s, which was growth, growth, growth. If you want to solve unemployment, growth more. Of course, there will be labor saving technology, more productivity. Well, you need to keep pushing the production up so that it catch up with greater productivity. So this is crazy. This is not. We need to find another way of addressing involuntary unemployment, way different from just further growth. I mean, this constant push for further growth. This was one reason. Of course, since then, it has only become sharper, and this was before we discovered climate change and all that. That was one reason. And the second reason, this was a few years before the collapse of the Soviet type of socialism. But I, along with others at the time, thought that the collective ownership of the means, state ownership of the means of production was not a promising future for our capitalist societies, something that you could defend with enthusiasm, because the performance was not good in terms of efficiency. It turned out to be not that brilliant either in terms of real equality, and it was terrible in terms of freedom. And so we needed something else, but something else that was not just a little bit of resistance here and there to protect workers' rights. We needed something that was inspiration for the future, something sufficiently radically different, and that would be an alternative both to the old socialist utopia of state ownership of the means of production, and also an alternative to the then incipient neoliberalism. And so neither sort of subjection of our lives to the state, nor subjection of our lives to the market. We needed something else. And it seemed to me that a basic income both offered a solution to the problem of unemployment that was not ecologically irresponsible, so it was addressing that question, and it offered a sort of mobilizing utopia for the future. And that's why I thought, well, this is really what I need today. So, of course, I started discussing it with a few people, wondering maybe there is a flaw with the idea. So I didn't discover, when you have a good idea, then there's always one of two things that happen. Either you discover there is a flaw and then you try to forget the idea and forget that you ever had it, or you discover that you are not the first one to have come to that idea. And of course that's what I discovered bit by bit. And also recently we still discover very old people, forgotten people who had come up with that same idea. And so that's how I came to it personally, and then, but I never suspected at the time that 35 years later I would still be talking to you about it, and indeed writing a book. So the book we just published in the US, I mean, that was, in a way I felt that I had a sort of duty to the idea itself, because of course after all those years I've been doing other things academically in between on other subjects, so it can become a bit repetitive. It's not, I still discovered things where, on the idea while working on this book, but I felt I had to do it, but I did it with a colleague, so that because there's a lot of fact-checking and all that was needed, I was happy to have help, but I felt I owe that, and I'm happy to have done it.